In today's video, we delve deep into the chilling stories of some of the most notorious criminals in history. Individuals whose names will forever be etched in infamy. These killers left behind a legacy of terror, and their trials became moments of raw emotion and shocking justice. So, how did these killers react when faced with the final verdicts of their monstrous actions? You won't believe the shocking twists that followed. The grief-fueled rage, Alfred Gaynor's trial. In Springfield, Massachusetts, a courtroom was the stage for not only a criminal trial, but also a shocking display of raw grief and vengeance. Alfred Gaynor, a man who's terrorized city for years, sat before the court, unaware of the furious wrath that awaited him. Alfred Gaynor's crimes began in the mid-1990s, when the city of Springfield was plagued by a series of brutal murders. Between 1995 and 1998, Gaynor assaulted and killed at least 9 women. The city was gripped by fear as a killer remained on the loose, targeting vulnerable victims. For years, Gaynor evaded capture, using his ability to blend into the community. But in 1998, investigators received a break. DNA evidence from the crime scenes matched Gaynor's, and he was arrested. Gaynor's method was one of cold, calculated violence. He targeted women, luring them under false pretenses before violently assaulting and murdering them. His attacks were swift and brutal, often leaving little evidence behind, but the pattern was unmistakable. For years, these unsolved murders terrorized the city, but the investigation ultimately pointed back to Gaynor, a man with a history of violent tendencies. His DNA, which had been left at multiple crime scenes, would ultimately seal his fate. As Gaynor stood trial for his heinous crimes, the courtroom was filled with family members of his victims, seeking justice. The courtroom, however, was not only a space for the law to take its course, but also a stage for a deeply emotional confrontation. Gaynor eventually pleaded guilty to all the murders he was accused of. He was sentenced to 8 consecutive life terms in prison, without the possibility of parole. Yet, even as the trial seemed to reach its conclusion, a much more personal and visceral form of justice would unfold. On the day of Gaynor's sentencing, the emotional toll of the trial reached its peak. Sitting quietly in the gallery was Eric Dees, the son of one of Gaynor's victims, who had been violently taken from him years earlier. Without warning, Eric Downs, overcome with grief and anger, leapt over the barricade. In a moment of uncontrollable rage, he launched himself toward the defendant, delivering one final blow to the man who had destroyed his life. Gaynor's sister attempted to intervene, but it was too late. Deputies quickly ushered Gaynor to safety, while chaos erupted in the courtroom. Eric Downs was charged with assault and contempt of court for his actions, but many would later sympathize with his uncontrollable rage, which had erupted in the face of years of suffering. Despite the dramatic courtroom incident, Gaynor's fate was sealed. He was sentenced to life behind bars, where he would remain for the rest of his life, a reminder of the horrors he inflicted on the women of Springfield. While Eric's act of violence was condemned, it highlighted the intense grief and the emotional toll that the loss of a loved one can inflict. In the end, Alfred Gaynor's legacy would be one of terror, but also of the deep, lasting scars left on the families of his victims. As we reflect on the case of Alfred Gaynor, we remember the lives lost, the families shattered, and the complex emotions that define the human experience. It is a story of both justice and the profound pain of those left behind. The case of Jeffrey Clark. In a quiet suburban neighborhood in Fraser, Michigan, a chilling and brutal crime would unfold on July 4, 2022. What began as a violent act of execution would lead to a high-profile trial, capturing the attention of not just the local community, but the entire nation. This is the story of Jeffrey Clark, a 33-year-old man who would go on to become the center of a murder investigation that shook his family and left an indelible mark on all those involved. Jeffrey Clark's early life was far from ordinary. Born and raised in Fraser, Michigan, Clark's upbringing didn't stand out in any particularly notable way, but like many troubled individuals, his background might offer some clues into his later actions. While not much is publicly known about his childhood, those closest to him would later suggest that he struggled with personal issues as he grew older. On the evening of July 4, 2022, Jeffrey Clark would carry out a crime that would forever alter the lives of his victim's family. The victim, 28-year-old Jer Robertson, was gunned down in an apartment complex parking lot. Clark chased Robertson down, cornering him before shooting him execution style. The incident, which occurred in the span of mere moments, was caught on a doorbell camera, providing authorities with undeniable evidence of the cold-blooded nature of the crime. Clark's presence at the crime scene was further confirmed by his ankle monitor, which had been tracking his movements. Despite his efforts to conceal his actions, the evidence placed him squarely at the scene of the murder, making it clear that this was no random act of violence, but a deliberate, premeditated execution. In the days following the murder, authorities swiftly pieced together the facts, using the doorbell camera footage and the ankle monitor data to track Clark's movements. Investigators quickly identified Clark as the primary suspect, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. As investigators delved deeper into the case, they uncovered more troubling details. Clark's girlfriend would later testify in court that after the murder, Clark had threatened her, further painting a picture of a man who was not only capable of murder, but had also engaged in violent and manipulative behavior in the aftermath. The trial of Jeffrey Clark was a highly charged event. With the evidence stacked against him, Clark's fate seemed all but sealed. The prosecution presented the doorbell camera footage, which clearly showed Robertson's execution-style killing, leaving little room for defense. The case was straightforward, but it was the emotional weight of the trial that truly struck those present in the courtroom. Among the spectators was Jer Robertson's twin brother Jerry, who was seated in the gallery during the trial. As the prosecution played the video of his brother's murder, Jerry's grief was palpable. Overcome with emotion, Jerry charged at the defendant in an outburst of rage, a moment that would shake the courtroom to its core. The attack was brief, but it was a powerful testament to the immense pain and anger that Jerry Robertson felt. It was a raw, unfiltered reaction to the injustice of losing his brother in such a brutal and senseless manner. Jerry's outburst wasn't limited to Clark. It also led to a confrontation with Clark's father, who attempted to intervene, upset that his son had been physically assaulted in the courtroom. The chaos that followed momentarily disrupted the trial, but order was eventually restored. Jerry Robertson was charged with contempt of court and assault, while Clark remained at the center of the case. With the emotional turmoil in the courtroom settled, the trial continued, and Jeffrey Clark was ultimately convicted of first-degree murder, felony firearm charges, and illegal possession of a firearm. Despite his conviction, Clark showed little emotion throughout the proceedings. His indifference only seemed to further anger those who had been impacted by his crime. In the end, the judge sentenced Clark to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His actions, which had so brutally stolen a life, would cost him his own freedom forever. But for the Robertson family, the sentence, while bringing a sense of justice, could never undo the pain and grief they would carry with them for the rest of their lives.
Watch closely. It only takes a moment.
Stay here!
The case of Eric Mullah. On July 29, 2015, a violent crime occurred that would forever alter the lives of those involved. Eric Mullah, a man with a troubled past, stood in court facing charges for assault and murder. The case took a dramatic turn when a violent outburst led to the death of his niece, Taisha Mullah. This is the story of Eric Mullah, the events that led to the tragic murder and the aftermath that followed. Eric Mullah's background reveals a history of personal struggles and a pattern of violent behavior. Little is known about his early years. but his adult life would be marked by interactions with the law, including previous assaults and criminal activities. Throughout his life, Eric struggled with emotional issues, which, coupled with personal turmoil, contributed to his increasingly erratic and violent behavior. On the fateful day of July 29, 2015, Eric Mulla found himself in court for assault and murder charges, but it was not his first crime. During the proceedings, an altercation occurred that would take a tragic turn. Lee Antoine, who was present in the courtroom for an unrelated case, was called as a witness. However, his involvement in the case took an unexpected and violent twist.
You can see in the video Antoine Lee attacking a homicide suspect during the man's court appearance last Tuesday. Lee was at the court appearance to testify as a witness, the man he's accused of attacking.
Amid the proceedings, Eric Mulla attacked Lee Antoine in the courtroom. The situation escalated quickly when, in the midst of the chaos, Eric fatally stabbed his niece, Taisha Mulla. Taisha's death shocked the courtroom and sent shockwaves through the community. What began as a routine legal process spiraled into a tragic and senseless act of violence. Following the outburst in the courtroom, authorities moved quickly to secure the scene and stabilize the situation. Witnesses were questioned, and the immediate focus shifted to Eric Mulla and his actions. The investigation revealed that the attack on Lee Antoine was not planned, but the tragic murder of Taisha Mulla was a result of the uncontrollable outburst. Despite the horrific nature of the incident, investigators had to focus on the sequence of events leading up to the stabbing. With witnesses providing testimony and evidence from the courtroom, it became clear that Eric's emotional state had played a role in the violence. The facts surrounding the murder of Taisha Mulla would be crucial in determining the charges that Eric would face. Eric Mulla's trial was marked by the overwhelming grief and shock of those affected by the crime. The prosecution presented the facts of the case, focusing on the brutality of the murder and Eric's history of violent behavior. The defense, on the other hand, argued that the incident was a result of emotional distress and an uncontrolled outburst in the courtroom. Eric's emotional state at the time of the murder was a key point of contention. The jury would have to decide whether Eric's actions were premeditated or the result of a sudden, uncontrollable burst of anger. The defense pushed for a reduction in charges, hoping that the emotional turmoil and suddenness of the attack would influence the jury's decision. After a lengthy trial, Eric Mulla was convicted of manslaughter instead of murder, as the jury found that the crime was not premeditated. The murder charge was reduced, and Eric was sentenced to 6 years in prison for the death of his niece, Taisha. Lee Antoine, who had been assaulted in the courtroom, was sentenced to 11 months and 29 days for his involvement in the incident. While Eric's sentence was significantly less than a murder conviction would have warranted, the tragic loss of Taisha Mulla's life remained the most profound consequence of that violent day. The courtroom scene, which should have been a place of justice, turned into a moment of devastating chaos. The case of Eric Mulla highlights the devastating consequences of unchecked violence, emotional instability, and impulsive actions. What was intended to be a legal proceeding became the scene of an irreversible tragedy. The lives of those involved would never be the same, and the ripple effects of Eric's actions would haunt his family and the community for years to come.
Ridgway, how do you plead to the charge of aggravated murder in the first degree as charged in count 1 for the death of Wendy Lee Caulfield?
Guilty.
The Green River Killer, Gary Ridgway. Gary Ridgway, one of the most notorious criminals in American history, carved his name into infamy through a brutal and chilling string of murders. Known as the Green River Killer, Ridgway's reign of terror spanned over 2 decades, with his crime methods and haunting psychology leaving a dark mark on history. Born in 1949, Gary Leon Ridgway's childhood was anything but ordinary. Raised in a turbulent household, he experienced a strained relationship with his mother, who was described as domineering, and his father, who expressed contempt toward adult workers. Ridgway's early years were marked by violent conflicts within the home, which would shape his troubled psyche. Ridgway himself later spoke of conflicted feelings toward his mother, describing a bizarre mix of attraction and anger. These feelings, combined with troubling incidents like an attack on a 6-year-old boy when Ridgway was just 16, foreshadowed a dark future. In the 1980s, Ridgway's predatory behavior took a chilling turn. He specifically targeted adult workers in the Washington area. Using deceptive tactics, he would lure them into his vehicle, often showing them pictures of his son to gain their trust. Once they were far from civilization, Ridgway would strangle his victims with his hands or a cord, leaving their bodies in remote areas. After the killings, Ridgway would often return to the crime scenes, engaging in necrophilia before ultimately burying the bodies in hidden graves. His hatred for adult workers was evident, yet ironically, he would sometimes engage with them sexually before their deaths. Despite being a suspect as early as 1982, Ridgway's identity remained elusive for nearly 2 decades. He passed polygraph tests in the early 90s, and his meticulous approach to covering his tracks kept him free from arrest. In 2001, a breakthrough came when advances in DNA technology allowed investigators to revisit evidence from the crime scenes. DNA samples linked Ridgway to the murders, leading to his eventual arrest. Ridgway was apprehended as he left work on November 30, 2001, marking the end of a long and tragic search for justice. Yet, the case was far from simple.
I whipped out my ID, and with my ID would be I'd put my finger over my driver's license to hide my name, but on the opposite side was pictures.
During his trial, Ridgway showed little emotion, even when faced with the heart-wrenching statements of victims' families. He admitted to killing at least 71 women, but refused to give full details about his motivations. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, Ridgway pled guilty to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder, providing information on where to find the remains of his other victims. This plea deal was controversial, but it spared further prolonged trials and brought closure to many families. Gary Ridgway was sentenced to 48 life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus 10 additional years for tampering with evidence. He now resides in the Washington State Penitentiary. While Ridgway's cold demeanor throughout the trial shocked many, one moment of emotion occurred when a victim's father expressed forgiveness. Ridgway, visibly moved, wept briefly. A brief moment of humanity amid his monstrous actions. Gary Ridgway's case stands as one of the most chilling examples of human depravity, leaving a legacy of suffering, loss, and unanswered questions. But as we remember his victims, we also reflect on the tenacity of law enforcement in bringing a killer to justice, ensuring that Ridgway will spend the rest of his life behind bars.
Whenever I try this case, or have any further proceedings, or I have to see you for one further setting.
The case of Bass Webb. In the criminal justice system, some cases stand out not only because of the severity of the crimes committed, but also because of the shocking behavior displayed by the perpetrators. One such case is that of Bass Webb, a man whose actions and antics in and out of the courtroom have made him one of the most notorious criminals in recent years. From a violent attempted murder to inciting a riot in jail and ultimately being convicted of murder, Webb's story is filled with chaos and controversy. Bass Webb, a man with a history of violent behavior, found himself in trouble with the law from an early age. Known for his anger and aggression, Webb had been incarcerated previously for assault. In 2021, he was serving a 3-month sentence for assault charges when he committed one of the most alarming crimes in his criminal history. In July of 2021, just a week before his court appearance, Webb became the focus of a harrowing incident outside the Kentucky jail. Surveillance footage captured the shocking moment when Webb, in an apparent act of revenge, accelerated his car toward 2 jail employees. One of the employees narrowly avoided the vehicle, while the other was pinned against a wall, suffering serious injuries. The attack was deliberate, and Webb's intent was clear: to harm those who worked at the jail. After being placed under arrest for attempted murder, Webb's case seemed to be spiraling further out of control. Webb's behavior in court only escalated the gravity of his case. During his initial court appearance, Judge Vanessa Dixon informed Webb that she would be recusing herself from the trial, citing her acquaintance with the targeted jail employees and a personal decision to avoid further interaction with Webb. But Webb's reaction to this decision was far from respectful. In an unprecedented moment of defiance, Webb spat on the judge. His action prompted immediate backlash from the court, with Judge Dixon ordering him to be charged with contempt of court. This was only the beginning of his disruptive behavior in the legal system. While awaiting trial, Webb continued his reign of chaos. Along with 4 other inmates, he incited a riot at the Fayette County Detention Center. The event was so intense that Webb was shot with beanbag bullets and struck in the neck with a pepper ball. However, even in the face of this, Webb remained undeterred and continued his aggressive behavior, hurling a metal telephone box at a corrections officer. The riot added new charges to Webb's growing criminal record, including third-degree assault. It was clear that Webb's violent tendencies were not isolated incidents, but a pattern of behavior that extended to all aspects of his life. But perhaps the most shocking chapter in Webb's criminal career came years after his previous offenses. In a twist that left many stunned, Webb was brought to court again, this time facing charges related to a cold case murder. In 2026, almost a decade after the crime, Webb was indicted for the murder of his former girlfriend, Bria Rooney-Witz. Bria Rooney-Witz, a promising law enforcement student and employee at the Bourbon County Jail, was reported missing in 2016. Her case remained unsolved until a tip from within the jail system led authorities to uncover her remains in a shallow grave. The discovery of Bria's body was the key to reopening the case, and Webb was arrested for her murder. The prosecution revealed that Webb had choked Bria to death before burying her in an attempt to cover up the crime. When Webb appeared in court for his trial, his appearance and behavior sent chills through those present. Gone were the days of an ordinary convict. Webb now sported sinister head tattoos, which seemed to indicate a disturbing hit list. The tattoos appeared to target judges, prosecutors, law enforcement officers, and the media, adding a chilling layer to his already volatile persona. Despite the seriousness of the charges, Webb's behavior in court remained defiant. When the judge asked him to stand for proceedings, Webb refused, smiling instead. His antics further reinforced the notion that he was a man with no respect for authority or the justice system.
Villegas, not guilty of...
The case of Daniel Villegas. Exonerations are rare, but some cases stand out due to the length of time innocent individuals are forced to endure wrongful convictions. One such case is that of Daniel Villegas, a man who spent 18 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. His story is a tragic reminder of the flaws in the justice system, but also a story of resilience and eventual redemption. Daniel Villegas was just 16 years old when his life was turned upside down. It was April 10, 1993, when 2 young men, Armando Mondo Lazo and Bobby England, along with 2 friends, were walking home from a house party in El Paso, Texas. As they walked down the street, a car approached slowly, turned around, and came back toward them. At that moment, a person from the back seat of the car opened fire, killing Lazo and England in cold blood. The shooting was brutal, and the tragedy shocked the community. But it was the aftermath of the crime, the investigation, and the wrongful conviction of Daniel Villegas that would capture national attention. There was no physical evidence linking Daniel Villegas to the murders. No DNA, no firearms, no forensic evidence tying him to the crime scene. So how did Daniel become the prime suspect in a double homicide? The answer lies in a single, deeply flawed confession. After the shooting, Daniel, who was known to have been at a party on the night of the murders, was brought in for questioning by the police. During the interrogation, an El Paso detective threatened Daniel with beatings and the death penalty unless he confessed to the crime. A 16-year-old boy, frightened and overwhelmed by the intense pressure, signed a prepared confession written by the detectives. This confession became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, even though Daniel tried to retract it just hours later, stating that it had been coerced. Despite the lack of any physical evidence, the false confession was used against him. Daniel Villegas was convicted of 2 counts of capital murder based solely on this coerced confession. The conviction marked the beginning of an 18-year nightmare. For 18 years, Daniel Villegas languished behind bars, convicted of a crime he didn't commit. But in that time, he never gave up on proving his innocence. His case became one of the most talked about wrongful conviction cases in the country, but it was a long and difficult journey for justice. During his time in prison, Daniel was able to start a new chapter in his life. He got married and started a family, all while continuing to fight the conviction that had stolen his youth and his freedom. But despite the years, the wheels of justice continued to turn slowly, and his case remained under constant scrutiny. In the early 2010s, new evidence came to light. Legal experts and advocates began to question the integrity of Daniel's conviction, and a renewed investigation into the case was launched. Eventually, it became clear that the prosecution's case against Daniel had been built on a coerced confession and no physical evidence to support it. As the case was reviewed, the wrongful conviction of Daniel Villegas was uncovered. In 2011, after 18 years behind bars, Daniel was granted bond and released from prison while awaiting a 3rd trial. This was the moment he had been waiting for, his chance at true freedom. The final trial was a defining moment in Daniel's life. Standing in the courtroom, Daniel faced the prospect of either returning to his family as a free man or being sent back to prison for a crime he did not commit. It had been a long and painful journey, but the truth was finally beginning to emerge. During the trial, the jury heard the full extent of the injustice that had been done to Daniel Villegas. They were presented with the facts. There was no physical evidence tying him to the crime, and the confession that had been used to convict him was obtained under duress.